welcome to day 7, which is our final coverage of chapter 4, display objects and touch. Alright, so display groups are also in the display table, so they're meant to be used with the shapes and also the widgets that you can put on screen. The syntax is pretty easy if you're doing it by hand. There's a new group function inside of the display table, and you just name the display group whatever you want it to. So for example, with the mobile development logo, you could create a display group called logo. It just has to be a valid Lua identifier. And then you use the insert function to add individual components to it. So if the logo is made up of these objects I show, object 1 through object 8, then you would use 8 insert calls to add each of those objects one at a time. And you might wonder, well, why would you want to do this? Well, the answer is then we can do stuff in a single line of code, potentially, that affects the entire logo. So we could do something like, move it or fade it out or fade it in. Almost whatever we wanted to do with it on screen, we can do with it now by a single reference to the display group logo or whatever you called it. So it makes working with these sorts of things that we draw quite a bit easier. You can create display groups in Drawn to Code. There's a display group button at the bottom of the display object. So you would create the display group and then give it a name. And then on each of your shapes or widgets, there's a button, Add to Display Group, which you see on the lower left of the slide that's up. So you just hit that button on anything you want to add to the display group, and you'll get a pop-up that lists all of your display groups, and you can select the one that you want to add it to. And then what you're seeing here is a screenshot. The right-hand side, the upper right-hand side screenshot is a display or a settings panel for a display group. So I'm just showing you really that you have a lot of control over what it looks like. You can move it, you can fade it in, fade it out, and that'll affect everything in the display group. If there's anything that throws people and sometimes trips me up is that the display group gets an alpha, so it's set to 0 here, which would mean it's invisible. But that also, it doesn't take away from all of the individual components alphas. So if you set something, one of those objects, say on this previous slide, if for instance, MOB was object, well, it wouldn't be, but let's say object 1 was the green background. On its settings panel, you can set its alpha to 0, and even if the display group alpha is 1, it still would not show the green background. So to actually see it, its alpha would have to be 1, and the display group's alpha would have to be 1. Yeah, the other thing that trips people up is just the order of this. But you can create the display group before you add stuff to it, or before you create the stuff that you would add to it, I mean to say, or you could create it after having created the stuff that you want to add to it, or you could create it after you've created some of the objects you want to add to it, and then go ahead and create more. It doesn't matter. The thing that matters, though, is that when you try to insert it, when this code runs, any of these statements run with the inserts, all of the objects you're inserting have to exist. So you cannot insert an object into a display group before you've created it. So in Drawn to Code, the implication is that the insert statements are paired up with the display group script object. So when writing that main.lua file out, when I hit the display group, I create the display group and I do all the inserts. But if then later you decided to create, for instance, in this example, I've got object for a rounded rectangle, and you add it to the display group, that's fine to do that, but in terms of the stack, you'd have to move object 4 up so that it's above object 3. So you want that display group to be the last thing, not necessarily in the stack, but it has to be below everything that you're putting into it. So if you wanted to add this object 4 to the display group, you can do it, but you can't have this script object beneath object 3. Object 3 is where the insert statements will be written out in your main.lua file, so it has to be after the creation of objects 1, 2, and 4 that you're trying to add to it. So the other thing we're going to do today is transitions. So a transition is essentially an animation that will take a display object or a widget and transition it from a starting state to an ending state over some period of time. So the first things that we're going to do with transitions are we'll use it to fade stuff in dramatically so that when your app loads, it's not there, and then over some period of time, some number of seconds, technically milliseconds, Solr 2D will change the alpha from 0 to 1. So over however many seconds you specify, 3 in this case, it will go from being completely invisible to completely visible. The syntax to do that takes essentially 2 steps. First off, to have it start out as invisible, you'll want to set the alpha to 0. So if we're, again, talking about this logo display group, you would set its alpha to 0 using that syntax, or in the display group settings panel, you would set it to 0. When the app loads and it's set to 0, it will not be visible. And then the transition uses syntax like this. There's a table called transition. There's a function called to, so this is a transition to, and the syntax is just you specify what you're transitioning, logo in this case, and then a table of settings. We know it's a table because it's surrounded by these curly braces, and it's a set of key value pairs separated by commas. And it can get actually quite a bit longer than this. This is about the world's simplest transition. And all it says is transition over 3,000 milliseconds, or 3 seconds, to alpha equals 1. Obviously in Draw-No Code, you'll have access to all of this via a transition script object that you add. So transitions are in the actions palette. And when you add a transition script object to your stack, you'll get this prompt up here for what would you like the target of the transition to be. For instance, in the stack that I'm screenshotting and talking about, the course logo, that's object 9, the display group logo. So if you wanted a transition to work with that display group, you'd select it from the script object pop-up. And then you'll get this big settings panel, which gives you control over what's your transition. What do you want to transition? So we'll do most of these at various points over the rest of the material, but initially we're starting out by changing the alpha. So if you want to modify the alpha to 1, you'll make sure the alpha slider's slid all the way over to 1, and you'll want to check the box. Checking the box is what tells Draw-No Code that you want this setting in the transition key value pair table. And you get to specify the time and also optionally a delay. So if you want this to wait 2 or 3 seconds before it fades in, you could specify that in this display milliseconds box. That is it for transitions. So let's switch to Draw-No Code and do a transition so that you get to experience that. All right, I'm not going to do the entire logo, but we'll do kind of a simple logo, kind of like the one we did last time, which was a circle with a kind of a Solr 2D logo. So I'm just going for something that's kind of sunny. That's not right. All right, we'll stick with that then. And there's no stroke because the stroke is 0, so there's our sun. Let me make it a little bigger. And then let's add some text to it that says, let's say Solr 2D. Okay, so I mean, if you're following along, what you've got is 2 display objects in your stack that form something like a Solr 2D logo. So let's create a display group now. The display group button is down here at the bottom. If you hit it, you'll get a pop-up dialog that asks you to name the display group. So let's name it logo. Again, I'm just doing that to be consistent with the keynote and what we've been talking about, but you could call it any valid Lua identifier. It should be unique. You do not want to give multiple display groups the same name, just as you wouldn't want to give multiple variables the same name. Dronacode tries to check for that, tries to make sure it's a valid identifier and a display name, but I don't guarantee that I do that perfectly. So just as you're thinking about the names, think of something that's descriptive, but is also a valid identifier and is unique. This display group settings are now here. So if we want to start out with this invisible, we'll want to move the alpha to 0. But let's add stuff to the display group first. So to add your display objects to the display group, you'll select, for instance, the circle first. And then if it's not on screen, scroll down to the Add to Display Group button. And hit it, and you get a pop-up dialog that asks you to select which display group you want. There's only one in this case, so you can just hit return or tap OK. We'll do the same thing to the text, Solar 2D. Scroll down until you see the Add to Display Group button, hit it, and hit OK. And your stack will update as you go to say Object 1 Circle in Display Group Logo, and Object 2 Text, Solar 2D, in Display Group Logo, and then finally Display Group Logo. Let's peek at the code that's generated. Okay, so here's Object 1, which is the circle. Here's Object 2, which is the text. Here's Object 3, which is the display group. And so notice in the display group on lines, for my stack, as generated, lines 21 and 22, no, 22 and 23 are the insert calls. So 23 says logo insert object 1, and sorry, the next one is logo insert object 2. So those insert statements can only work if object 1 and object 2 exists. That is, they have to have already been created in your stack or in the main.lua file. If object 1 or object 2 is nil here, we'll get an error and this won't work right. So we can save it and fire up Corona to get it going. So not super exciting yet, Solar, it just shows the logo Solar 2D. So let's make it invisible. So to do that, I'm going to select the display group in the stack and then slide that alpha value slider over to 0. And if you're watching the code that's generated, what you'll see is it's added a logo.alpha equals 0 line. All right, save that code. And there's the Solar 2D simulator. Now is somehow even less exciting because it's just blank. Obviously that's what you would expect, but I know it's not terribly exciting. Let me go ahead and save this design too because I want to set a good example. We're in chapter 4. That's the old Solar 2D logo, so I'm gonna make one now that is a folder that is transition or transitions, and then inside of that folder I'll say yeah, Solar 2D transition, logo transition, something descriptive. Again, I can put spaces and stuff in here. I don't have to make it a valid identifier. But anyway, now it's saved so that as we make changes to the design, the code will regenerate and save itself automatically, and the simulator will update automatically, which just makes everything a little bit easier in terms of iterating changes to a design and wanting to see if those changes did what you hope they would do. That obviously doesn't change anything about what we're seeing on screen. It's still an empty simulator. So what do we want to do next? We want to add a transition. Transitions are in the Actions palette, so select Actions, and then just find your way down almost to the bottom to the Transition button and hit that. And then Dronacode is going to prompt you and say, okay, what do you want to transition? What's the target of the transition? And if you peek, you'll see We could do the transition on the circle, the text, or the display group. Display group was selected in the dialog when it opened, and that's because it's selected in the script stack. So before you hit that transition button, if you select in the script stack what you want to transition, it'll be loaded here as the default that you want to target. And so you can just hit OK. And then we'll get this settings panel for the transition. And it confirms you're transitioning object 3, a display group, and it gives you access to all these settings. What we want is the alpha. So I'm going to slide the alpha over to 1. I'm going to hit the checkbox. There we go. And then we can think about our settings here. So the default in Solar 2D is for a 1-second animation transition, but you can obviously do whatever you want. There's a 4-second transition, and we can wait for a second before we start. So that'll give us a nice, slow, dramatic transition. So let's save it, see if we can watch it. Again, it's a nice, slow fade-in effect. You didn't have to specify all of the alpha values in between to do that. So Solar 2D builds up this animation kind of frame by frame to get you from where the object was, in this case alpha 0, to where you asked it to get to, alpha 1, over the period you specified in the time setting. Well, and we'll do a lot of transitions, in examples to come. So you'll get experience doing, variations of this. But that's your first basic transition, a slow, dramatic fade in of the logo. I think we've already actually played some sounds as part of different follow-along activities, but you can play sound effects, you can play background music. Drawing a Code makes it pretty easy, but it's a 2-step process. You have to load the sound either as a sound effect or as a background sound. You have to load it using the load sound function in the audio table before you can play it. And you only have to load the sound once. So there's no need to reload the sound every time you want to play it. You load it once. I typically put load statements up towards the top of the stack so that the sound starts loading, right away, because it's not necessarily going to load instantly. And then anytime I want it to play, I call audio.play. So you load it once, you play it as many times as you like using the play statement. In Drawing a Code, the load sound and the play sound script objects are inside of the action palette. So you want to load it first using the load sound script object. It'll prompt you for a valid sound file on your system. And then you set it to be a sound effect or a background music. And then anytime you want to play it, you add a play sound action script object and put it where you want it in your stack. Drawing a Code will give you a text description of where that sound file is. So you really need to put these resources in with your design. So wherever your design and your main.lua are, whatever folder you've created to put them in, you want to put your sound files and your images in that same folder typically. And so by default, Drawing a Code will copy whatever you identify into that folder for you. But that is a setting you can change and you can disable. It's okay if you do. The problem is that when you try to share a design like this that has any images or sounds, and you've left the images and sounds in different folders on your hard drive, and you try to send someone the design in the main.lua, when they try to run it, it's probably not going to work because they won't have those same files in the same random folders maybe that you have them. Or not random, maybe you've tried to organize everything very carefully, but they use a different organizing system. So it's much more likely to work fine for, say, everyone on your team that you're working with if you put those resources in that same folder. Moving ahead to touch. And this is also something we've done just because it's awfully fun and it's fairly easy. We've actually used tap to do stuff. We did a simple counter with a tap. And we've used touch to allow us to drag stuff around. So the two basic, touch listeners are for tap and for touch. The syntax is name what you want to listen for taps or touches on. You add a listener to it using add event listener, and you say what is it you want to listen for. So if you want to listen for taps, you specify tap. And then you specify the name of a function that you want Solr2D to run when logo is tapped. So for example, if you called it logo tapped, you would have to then supply a function that looks something like this, which was called logo tapped. So the name here has to match the name here. Also, in terms of order, this function has to exist when you add the listener. So when you add event listener and say logo tapped, Solr2D looks for this function logo tapped. I mean, just from a line-by-line standpoint, the function has to be above the add listener function call. If you get them out of order, let's say you put this function below, the connection between the tap listener and the function won't be established. You won't get an error, it just doesn't make a connection. And so in Drawn to Code, I'm pretty careful. When you add the tap listener, there's an add listener button on stuff that you can add listeners to. So for instance, the logo display group has an add listener button, and you could hit it and then specify you want to add the tap listener. And then in your script stack, what you'll get is above the display group, you'll get this tap handler. And it's in the proper order that it needs to be, so it's above the display group. It's called object 9 tap handler, or it's named based on whatever that object number is. You can move stuff around. We move stuff around in Drawn to Code, obviously to organize stuff. But if for whatever reason later you move this display group up, let's say, or you move the tap handler down and get them out of order, you'll run into that same issue, which is Drawn to Code will generate the script statements and they'll be out of order because they're going to follow whatever you put them in your stack. All right. Hey, we've hit the special time in the live Zoom where if you are online, I will take a quick screenshot so that you get bonus galleon. All right, done. Done. Last issue before we switch gears back into Drawn to Code to do something is flow of executions and functions. So when your script loads, it starts at the top. So the very first Lua statements are the ones that are executed. And the scripts that we're generating from Drawn to Code, that's typically, for instance, require statements. But then there will be shapes, display objects, there will be widgets. The widgets will be connected to listeners. Those listeners will execute functions in your stack that will run when the listened for event occurs. But what throws people sometimes is as you look at the stack in Drawn to Code, or as you look at the main.lua file that's executed, you'll see these functions. Even some of the most simple apps we write will have, if we use a widget, it will have a function for every widget. If we've done anything else, there may be additional listeners with additional event handling functions. So you'll look at the script and you'll see, there's a function, here's a function, there's another function, there's another function. And what throws people is sometimes they think that those functions will run when the script loads. In other words, when you launch it in the simulator, people get confused and think that code inside of these functions somehow gets executed. So it's important to know that that's not true. Functions are not executed when your script loads. The way to think about it is just that the functions are read in and made ready to run, but functions are not executed until either you as the programmer call the function, or if they're event handlers, they'll be run when that listened for event occurs. In terms of flow of execution, as soon as you start having functions, then the flow of execution starts to bounce around a little bit more. So visually, if you're a little bit more visually inclined like I am, if we had a script with, let's say, 5 of these statements, I've called them statement 1, statement 2, statement 3, statement 4, statement 5. We also have a function, I've called it getBalance. So if this top to bottom order is as you see it, statement 1 is above this function, and the function is above statement 2. When your app loads, statement 1 executes, and then statement 2 executes. The function does not execute. The only time the function executes is if it's called either by the event handler or by you, the programmer. So if statement 3, for instance, calls getBalance, then the flow of execution will jump up to getBalance. And at that point, the code inside of getBalance will run. And when it's done, the flow of execution will return to the next statement in your script, statement 4, which we're going to call statement 5. So the order is top down, except when you call functions, then the flow of execution will jump to that function somewhere above in the code typically. It's obviously it's crucial to know when a statement that you write will run. It's crucial to know in what order the statements you write will run, and of course the number of times that they'll run, but we haven't really gotten to that yet. All right, so I'm going to skip back to drawing a code, but this is the end of chapter 4. Covered a lot of ground: basic shapes, colors, gradients, flow of execution, display groups, transitions, tap listener, load and play sounds. All of that is packed into this chapter. So we've got our logo display group here. It already has a transition, so wanted to add certainly tap to it and play sound to it. So to add the listener, the tap listener to it, we'll select the display group in our stack and then scroll down the settings panel to add listener. If you hit add listener, then you'll get this choice of listeners pop up, and tap's the one typically we want. Again, the difference is touch lets you drag something around. Tap just responds to the user, tapping on it with their fingers. So if you want to add tap, you just select tap, and then what you'll see is here's the display group. It's still selected because I selected it to get to its settings panel to add the tap listener. And here's the tap handler, and it's been placed carefully in our stack directly above what we added the listener to. So that's the way it will work every time, is whenever you add a listener to something in Drawing a Code, you'll get that event handling function, and it'll be placed directly above what you added the listener to. So if we peek at the code, likewise, what you'll see is here's the add event listener call on line main.lewis on line 56, adding the tap listener. The named handler is object3 tapped handler, and then right up here above it is object3, the function object3 tap handler. So this is the order that you got to maintain. If for whatever reason you got this out of order, then the listener would not get properly attached. All right, if we go back to the design and relaunch it, what you'll see is I want my console. Where's my console? No, where's my console? Huh. Well, hopefully you have your console, and you should see in the console when you tap it, it'll display information at the console about the tap. There it is on a different screen. All right, let me bring it back. Okay, so here's what I was trying to talk about, which is every time you tap, you'll see something like this, which I assume you guys were already seeing. Obviously, that's not super exciting. It's tap on ID logo. So let's play a sound. So to play a sound, we will head to the actions palette, and we want to load the sound first. So we'll hit load sound, and then we've got to find the sound. So as part of the book downloads, I have a variety of resources in that download. I think I've organized that on my system into a resource folder with sounds, although cha-ching is not there. Doesn't really matter. You can use whatever sounds you want. So I've got bounce in there, so I use bounce. But if you have any other sound effects, you can find it and select it. And then if we take a look inside of this folder, chapter 4 folder, inside transitions, you'll notice inside my folder is now bounce.wav. That's not where it was, but it was copied automatically into that project design folder to make it easier for you. If you stick with that setting in Draw to Code, it'll try to keep everything together in that design folder for you. So if we look at our stack, what we'll see is there's this load sound at the bottom. That won't play the sound, so let's just save it and double check so you believe me. If you restart your app now, you'll see the transition executes, but there's no sound. There's no sound because we haven't played it. So if you're already ahead of me, you can hit play sound and save it and see what happens. Let's do that. So if you hit play sound, Draw to Code will display any sounds that you've loaded, which you can then select and hit OK, and then we'll add the play sound script object to your stack. Let's save it and see what happens. All right, so you guys are all muted, so I can't hear, but I'm hoping you guys hear some cha-chings or some other sounds that you had. The chapter resources are linked in the book. They're also linked in that the chapter 2 setup chapter, I think, where we have that table with all the downloads. It's in there too. If you haven't downloaded it, you want to download that resources folder and put it in this folder where you're designing all your mobile apps so you can get to it easily. Hopefully you heard the sound playing. So, just let's think about it for a little bit. It plays when we start the app. So let me show you that again. I'm going to restart the app. So you hear it play right away. That may not be what you expect because we added that tap listener. You probably thought we were going to make it play when you tap the logo. That would make sense. So why is it not doing that? It's not doing it because the play sound is in the main top-down execution order for your app. So it plays automatically right after it loads anytime you load your app. That's not what we want. We want the sound to play when we tap the logo. So we have a function here set up into which we can put code or script objects that we want to run when the tap occurs. So I want to move this play sound script object into this object3 tap handler function. That will make it only execute when a tap occurs. So the mechanics for doing that, if you're coding by hand, you just type it in that function or you copy and paste it into the function. What we're going to do is in our stack, I'm going to select that play sound. That's what I want to move. And in the settings panel here, there's a button, Move Play Sound into Function. That's what we want to do. Hit that. Draw to Code will list any functions you have. We only have the one, so it's super easy. Hit OK. And if you were watching your stack, what you'd see is that play sound jumped out of the main execution order and into this object3 tap handler function. If we save this, what you'll notice is the sound didn't play. It will play though when we tap the logo. It will not play if I tap anywhere else. If you guys are following along, hopefully you've gotten that to work. There are issues that confuse people here. Sometimes one is they look at it and say, well, wait a minute, you don't load the sound until all the way down here, but you play it up here. That's above. That's above. You play it here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 script objects down from the top, but you don't load it here until 7 from the top. How does that work? Again, it's a flow of execution issue. This play sound, this snippet, and this play sound do not run when the app starts. The function is read and made ready to run, but it is not run. No code in here executes. The load sound script object is executed before it's possible that any of this would be run. Now that said, what I normally do in my stack is I move loads up. That is not strictly necessary, and you'll see it makes absolutely no difference in terms of the operation of the app. All right, that's what I wanted to get through today. Hopefully you've got a firmer handle or a firm handle on using display objects, drawing stuff, organizing your stuff into groups, doing stuff to the groups like transitioning and adding listeners to them, and then doing stuff in response to events like playing a sound when a tap occurs. And that's what I wanted to get through today.